I'm Will Beardsley from the Process and Faith program. We're talking to Clark Williamson, Professor of Theology at the Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. And we're going to think about Jewish-Christian relations and how a process point of view can open up this difficult but tremendously important subject for the church today. Clark, you've been increasingly involved in what you think, and I think rightly, Christian misunderstandings not only of Judaism, but of the role of Jesus in the foundation of Christianity. You might want to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll come back to see how the process background has helped you to get into this subject.
Okay, let me just briefly try to spin out the problem as I see it in Christian understandings of Judaism and therefore Christianity itself. We have for a long time, it's hard to know exactly how long, but a very long time, misunderstood both Jesus and Judaism and thereby also ourselves. That is to say, Christians have understood themselves in a works-righteous sense as displacing Jews and Judaism in the covenant with God and in God's love. We have thought that we had a better religion than they, and that this works-righteous notion of having a better religion somehow entitled us to displace them in God's favor. And this is a view that has many ramifications, and one finds throughout the history of the church from about as far back as one can go until about as recently as one comes. It's not necessarily tied up with any attitudes of animosity or negative feelings toward Jews. It's so old and hoary that it's just a kind of second attitude, second nature way of thinking and talking that Christians engage in very easily without even knowing they're doing it. In that respect, it strikes me as like using sexist or exclusive language when you don't realize you're doing it in an exclusive way. I mean, you may not know that, but you're doing it. If you persist in doing it after the issue's been raised, then it's another matter. Then you're deciding to be exclusive. If you persist in anti-Jewish ways of thinking after the issue's been raised, then we can say then you're deciding to be that way. But for most people, it's not a matter of decision. It's just an inherited pattern, but nonetheless one that has very negative consequences because we fail to understand God as genuinely gracious. We fail to understand that God transcends the church. We work on a kind of an economy of the scarcity of divine grace. God can't love both them and us. This is what the Epistle of Barnabas said long ago, you know. I mean, what do you mean? They and the covenant is both theirs and ours. Barnabas objects to someone in the Alexandrian church. They lost it. We got it. It's ours, you know.
Yes.
This is very interesting for its assumptions about God and about the covenant. It denies the faithfulness of God. I mean, I think if we think about that for a minute, we probably wouldn't want to worship a God who would drop us because of our sinfulness, because we've given ample reason to be dropped long ago. And yet we say that's exactly what God did with the Jews, you see. John Updike, in one of his books, says that's what God did with America. That God used to love us, but like a husband who used to come home to his wife regularly and bring flowers, God has now gone somewhere else, which is a criticism of America by Updike. But as poetry, it's one thing. As theology, it's something quite another. As self-criticism, it would be one thing. As a criticism of others, it's very different. Well, I rattled on there for a while.
So where do we go from here, Clark?
Well, we have to reconstruct Christian understandings on all these points. Doing new work on the historical Jesus as a Jew in his time and place. In here, I think the interesting way process thought helps us is that the standard scholarly approach to Jesus isolates him from his context as though he were not related to anything around him or before him or after him, that nothing Jewish went into the making of him. He was not, as we say, internally related to his context, nor externally related to his future, made no impact on it. And this is the assumption that many historical scholars use when trying to get at Jesus.
That's the criterion of dissimilarity, as they call it.
Right, that's the criterion.
If it's going to come from Jesus, it's got to be different.
Got to be absolutely different from all the teachings of the Judaisms of his time before, and from all the teachings of the later church. That's the way it gets formulated. Now, to a process thinker, this is a metaphysical and historical impossibility. See, when you do that, you have denied that this is an historical figure. So you know, as a process thinker, looking at that kind of scholarship, that you can't buy the method, much less the results of the method. And so to understand Jesus as internally related to his past and, in the process language and impacting his future, creating a field of force, as John Cobb puts it somewhere, that impacts the future, then you have to find a new way to get at that figure, to contextualize him. And that's what I try to do with the figure of Jesus, is to find some way to put him back in his time and place. It's very difficult because, as you know, the problem with the Gospels is that so much is attributed to him. The church freely would attribute to him things that it thought he ought to have said.
Yes.
Which I think, that's fine and lovely. I mean, I don't mind that, except it's a difficult historical problem then to figure out which is which. Which did he really say, and which is he just said to have said. But what I've tried to do recently with regard to Jesus is to look at things that are such big items. That he was a man named Joshua or Yeshua, Jesus being the transliteration of that. That he lived in Israel, not Minnesota. That he was a Galilean. That he called disciples. That he ate with them. That he told stories that are fascinating stories when we read them as Jewish stories. We see interesting things there. We see that the father in the parable of the prodigal son was enabled to stay on the farm and be a father because of the faithfulness of the elder brother. And that the father tells the elder brother at the end of the story, "You're always with me." And that's the Jew.
That's a very telling illustration, prodigal, I think. No. Yes.
We're the prodigal there in that story because we were dead and are now alive. I mean, that's the interpretation of us there.
Do you want to just say one word on how this work of yours has helped you in your understanding and relations with Jewish people today, or the whole Jewish community?
Well, it helps me the primary thing it helps me do is not, it helps me develop lots of interesting and friendly relationships with some marvelous human beings whom I'm very happy to have gotten to know, and from whom I learn a lot about what faith is, which has to do with doing the will of God, much more than it has to do with yakking about it, which we Christians do a better job of. But it also helps me do my job as a theologian, which is to criticize the witness of the church in the light of the gospel. And I feel like I'm doing that now better than I've ever been able to do it before. And it's because I've stumbled onto this stuff, you see, that's enabled me to do it. And it's a use of process categories that enabled me, at least, quickly to start making use of this sort of stuff. And a lot of us, we hit it, and it's really befuddling. It's so strange to us. But, when we realize, for instance, that Christianity is not a substance that endures through time unchanged, but a living tradition that becomes and changes. It's creative. Sometimes it changes in the wrong ways, but sometimes it changes. It can be self-critical. So it's I've become more of a kind of a process Catholic with regard to tradition. The very notion that the church ever reforming itself is itself a tradition. And this is what it can do. So this gives me a way of thinking about it which is really hopeful for change. Whereas I have a friend who realizes that anti-Judaism is such a constant in Christian history that he thinks the church cannot change. And the reason I think he thinks that is because metaphysically he will use the word often essentially. Christianity is essentially anti-Jewish. And I think he's wrong. It's not essentially anything. It's, you might say it's becomingly.
Because it always has the potential for a fresh beginning.
For a fresh beginning and for a change. And I think God has got quite a problem with the church. It's and I think God is working hard at calling it forward to something new.
Thank you, Clark. This has been Clark Williamson talking about Jewish-Christian relations.